Okay, so for this class, we're talking about how political power is organized and concentrated in the United States. And going back to the question I brought up from last class, kind of the key critical question we'll be looking at throughout the semester is whether or not the United States can actually be considered a democracy or not. So the idea of a democracy, as we understand it, generally goes back to ancient Greece. In more modern political terms, we understand a democratic government as a system of government where political power is vested in the people. As it says here, the government is based on the consent of the governed. Citizens participate in the decision making process through elections and have the right to voice their opinions and influence policies. Democratic regimes aim to ensure the protection of individual rights and freedoms and promote the rule of law. So, in other words, power in a democratic government is sort of widely shared, right? The average person has a share in exercising power in the government, even if it's in an indirect fashion through voting for representatives. This idea is encapsulated by Abraham Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address: government of the people, by the people, and for the people. So it is a people centered form of government essentially. And again, we sort of take it for granted that the United States is a democratic government. But if a democratic government is a government where the people rule, I mean, is that actually the case in the United States? Does the average person really have any say in what the government does at all? And I would take a very sort of critical view on that stance and argue, for the most part, no, not really. And that'll be something that we consider not just in this class, like I said, but basically going throughout the rest of the semester as well. And so to critically investigate these concepts, I've selected the essay by Sheldon Wolin, his essay, what he terms inverted totalitarianism. And he takes a very sort of critical view on this idea that the citizens really have any say over what the government does at all. Now, a few things that need to be discussed about this concept. One is the terminology that he uses here. I'm not really such a big fan of the concept that he uses, the terminology that he uses, even though I agree with what a lot of what he says as he describes this phenomenon. But basically, why does he refer to it as totalitarianism? So again, as I already kind of hinted at last class in the introduction to this class, totalitarianism is historically associated with governments like Nazi Germany, depending on your political views, the Soviet Union or other so-called communist governments as well. It is a system of government where basically the government has complete or total control over all aspects of society. That includes education, that includes the media. The political power of the state is virtually unlimited. Opposition parties to the ruling government are basically banned. Legal restrictions on the power of the government are basically non-existent. And he's saying that something like that, or at least something very similar to that, is what exists now in the United States. I would also point people's attention to the interview that he does, which I've posted with the journalist Chris Hedges. It's, I think, well worth watching if you haven't already. It's a bit long. It's about a 3-hour interview, which they do, although it's broken up into several different parts. And each part's only about 20 to 30 minutes long. What I would also recommend, going on YouTube, you can, and I'll include a link to it. You can play around with the settings. You can actually speed up the playback speed. You can sort of listen to it in about half the time. Of course, they're talking a bit fast there. But if you put the captions on and pay attention to it, you can actually absorb the information pretty quickly, I think. I would recommend that. Since the essay here is actually fairly short, Wolin would later expand this essay into a book, which was published a few years after this article was written in 2003. So the term totalitarianism gets thrown around a lot. Like I said, politically, not even one even seems to agree on what would be considered a totalitarian regime. In the political science literature, there's also a difference between what they call an authoritarian regime and a totalitarian regime. So the actual usage of these concepts can be a bit slippery sometimes. The one government everyone pretty much seems to agree upon was a totalitarian government, was Nazi Germany. So we'll probably fall back on that as our sort of go-to example in comparison for the most part. Um, Now, before we get to this idea of what inverted totalitarianism is, what is sort of the classical idea? And he does use this term of classical totalitarianism. According to Wolin, it's expressed by this formula of politics over economics. In other words, the political realm, the government, or the state, as some people call it, again, in the political science literature, that's usually the preferred terminology. The state basically takes over, every other aspect of life, some of which I've just covered: education, media, uh, the economic spaces of society as well. That all basically more or less comes under the domination of the state. Um, when Wolin introduces that idea of inverted totalitarianism, he's saying that it's basically flipping this upside down. So rather than politics over economics, you have economics over politics. So for Wolin, inverted totalitarianism means that the corporate realm, the economic realm of large corporations and banks, have essentially taken over government, and by extension basically taken over most other aspects of life: media, culture, again, education. All these things are basically come under the domination of large corporations. um and that's fine. I have no problem with that part. um the thing though is that, is this flipping it upside down actually a necessary thing? In other words, do you even really need to call it inverted totalitarianism, or was it, totalitarianism, even in the so-called classical forms, always about that? In other words, Wolin seems to suggest that there was a period of time where, again, governments like Nazi Germany were able to essentially subjugate or subordinate the economic system, capitalism, basically to the political demands of the state. That essentially the political, again, realm was sort of dictating terms to the economic realm. However, not every theorist that has written extensively on totalitarianism or fascism, these two terms often go hand in hand, um, would agree with that. For some people, and I tend to incline more towards this view myself, fascism or totalitarianism um, was essentially always about economic interests dominating over other aspects of life. So some of the important people that have held that view include people like Leon Trotsky, who was one of the leaders of the Russian Revolution, which established the Soviet Union; Franz Neumann, Otto Kirchheimer, Antonio Gramsci, Amadeo Bordiga, Anton Pankouk. Um, Now, aside from Trotsky, these were all basically German or Italian um, theorists and activists who had, basically firsthand experience dealing with fascism in Italy and in Germany. The two, sort of classic examples, like I said, of fascist governments. I mean, fascism itself basically comes from the name fascism comes from the political party created by Benito Mussolini, who was the dictator of Italy, going back to the 1920s, predating even Hitler's rise in Germany. So Pankouk was Dutch from the Netherlands, but basically was very active in the German Socialist Party at that time. Like I said, aside from Trotsky, these were all basically German or Italian figures who had basically firsthand experience dealing with these types of governments. And for them, they were unmistakably clear. But even in these versions, it was always about, again, economic interests basically sort of dictating um, the political objectives of the state. But what were those interests, basically? Well, on the one hand, they were about basically crushing working class resistance to capitalism. It is not a, should not be taken as a coincidence at all that in countries like Germany and Italy, where you did see the emergence of fascism, these were also countries where you had basically the most radical and revolutionary workers' movements that were engaged in revolutions and occupying factories and trying to take over urban spaces, literally trying to physically occupy these spaces and take them over. And so that kind of resistance had to be crushed and crushed violently, which of course it was. So the emergence of fascism played that played a political role, but was basically playing a political role in service of the economic interests of capital. And I would say the other major objective was to sort of revive the economies of these countries, which had basically fallen under hard times, especially Germany, but Italy too. Italy was considered, in many ways, a kind of economically underdeveloped country at that point, and so fascism was sort of seen as a way to sort of accelerate the economic growth of Italy, which it did do to a certain extent, and just as the economic policies in Germany did help revive the German economy for a period of time. So again, even in these instances here, you can see that there are, basically economic interests dictating what is happening in the political sphere. So, long story short, basically, there may not really be a need to invert totalitarianism. This idea of politics over economics, economics over politics, may actually be somewhat of a misleading view, and this is where maybe I disagree with Wolin a little bit. In all instances, it's basically always economics over politics. But that's not to say that Wolin's view doesn't have some merits in other ways. I just think it's important to explain that from the get-go. Now, there's a very ongoing debate now whether or not the United States is becoming a fascist type of government. And one of the major objections to that view is that, well, there is no radical workers movement in the United States as there was in Italy and Germany, and that's a fair argument to make. I do think you could respond to that in some ways. You could maybe argue, well, to some extent, this is sort of a preemptive move. This is a move to sort of, if the United States is, descending into fascism, this is an attempt to sort of preempt or to to preemptively strike basically before you have the emergence of a truly revolutionary movement here in the United States. It also, takes a very relatively short historical view of politics in the United States, because you could argue that there was movements towards a more revolutionary politics in the United States in the 1930s, and that was basically crushed after World War II. So and in some ways the radical left in this country, particularly a labor-based, class-based movement in this country, never really fully recovered from that. So the crushing of working class resistance in this country did occur, it just occurred at a much earlier date. But we can sort of come back to these issues later on in the semester, particularly when we talk about things of whether or not Trump would be considered a fascist and things like that. I mean, that actually to some extent gets a little bit away from what Wolin is talking about here. So why would I use Wolin's view if I somewhat disagree with this idea of inverted totalitarianism to begin with? In fact, is not an inversion, sort of an upside down version of totalitarianism, but basically represents a kind of continuity of economic interest, sort of dictating politics. Wolin does highlight certain other differences between, again, classical totalitarianism and what he calls inverted, the inverted kind. Differences which I still think are important to point out, even in spite of maybe me disagreeing with him over this idea of politics over economics becoming economics over politics. Some of the things that he points out that separate the U.S. version of this from the classical versions, again, Italy and Germany in particular, is that those systems, those regimes, relied much more on a kind of cult of personality, right? What Wolin refers to as the leadership principle, and that all sort of power was sort of vested in the supreme leader, whether it be Mussolini or Hitler. And again, there are other examples you could throw in there as well: Stalin, Mao, Castro, whoever. Um, there's much more of a kind of cult of personality built around these figures, that these leaders were in fact actually empowered to act in ways which is different than what you see in the United States, right? We don't have a supreme leader in this way that's able to exercise power in a more or less unlimited way. Now, that being said, I mean, I do think it is a concerning thing to look at how you see, especially in the second Trump administration now, the attempts to sort of strip away the so-called, constitutional checks and balances that you see on the power of the executive branch, largely sort of carried out by the conservative Supreme Court. But again, that's another issue that we'll get to. At least up until now, you have not seen this kind of leadership principle, this so-called cult of personality, develop in a way in the United States that you had, for example, in Nazi Germany. So that would be one difference. Wolin says, in contrast to this, sort of supreme leader figure, it's much more of a kind of faceless, anonymous sort of corporate state, right? It's various, bureaucratic instruments sort of, all working at the same time. It's sort of, it's power sort of exercised through the supposedly, impartial nature of the law and the legal system, not necessarily, these sort of, edicts, these, exertions of will carried out by the supreme leader figure. So that is one difference I think is important to keep in mind. Wolin also emphasizes this idea of mass mobilization in the classical versions, whereas in the United States, it's just the opposite, right? It's power is preserved at the very top by making citizens passive, by making them feel helpless, by making them isolated and disconnected from each other, and thus by breaking them up in that way, they're unable to sort of effectively exercise power against the ruling elite. Now, that is another important point. Certainly, the sense of passivity is a very important thing to keep in mind. However, I wonder if to some extent this idea of mass mobilization, in other words, that the way in which fascists in Italy and Nazis in Germany exercised power was that they were able to get these sort of large movements of people out there supporting them, these big parades and demonstrations and things like that, and fighting as well. Both Germany and Italy during this period of time, you would frequently see street battles basically erupt between fascists and Nazis versus essentially communists, who were sort of like the arch enemies of fascists, going on quite often during this period of time. That being said, and again, going back to the political science literature, the distinctions usually what is made between a so-called totalitarian regime and a merely authoritarian regime, supposedly in a large extent, to a large extent, hinges on this idea as well. The totalitarian systems rely upon this mass mobilization of people, the large, popular movements, popular followings of people to support them. I wonder if that is, though, exaggerated to some extent, because while that does play a role sort of early on in the establishments of these regimes, like in Italy and Germany, I think once you see these governments sort of take power and sort of consolidate their power, that kind of mobilization does kind of go away to a large extent. These governments then do tend to function more of a kind of bureaucratic way of functioning, basically, and do kind of demobilize their people, and do kind of encourage people to be a little more passive. So I wonder if that separation between those two is somewhat exaggerated to a certain extent. Yes, there are still demonstrations and things like that, but they become much more of a kind of formality in many ways. Probably not that much difference than what you see people do, for like a 4th of July parade, quite frankly. Once these governments, like I said, Germany and Italy in particular, have taken power. I think, though, probably the most important point that Wolin makes about this idea of inverted totalitarianism he describes in the United States, the most important point is this idea of this kind of sort of superficial illusion of democracy that takes place. In other words, we have all the formalities of different political parties and a supposedly open media where you can question things and elections and things like that. So on the surface, and again, in a fairly superficial way, it appears as if it is a functioning democratic government. There's a contest for power. You don't just have one group ruling all the time. You don't have all other political parties banned except for the fascist party in Italy and the Nazi party in Germany, for example. Um, where in those examples you don't even really have any kind of pretense. You don't even have the illusion of democracy, so to speak. In the United States, much more effort is made to sort of maintain this illusion of democracy, but as Wolin points out, it is basically an illusion. It's the superficial construction of political contest taking place, but really at the end of the day, no matter which party is in power, it's basically the same interests that are being served. It's the same sort of corporate and capitalist interests that are being served, regardless of which party is in power. And frankly, that could be a bit of a bitter pill for a lot of people to swallow, right? I mean, depending upon your political views, many people probably want to criticize the Republican Party. But when you start to realize that, well, the Democratic Party is kind of the same and is serving a lot of the same interests, a lot of people have a harder time accepting that. And of course, conversely, if you're a Republican, especially nowadays, you want to think Trump is this outsider and he's going to drain the swamp and do all that other stuff. You don't want to realize, no, even when Trump is in power, he's basically governing in the same way as every other president has basically over the last 40 years, if not longer than that. So that is, I think, the most important point, is that all this sort of this surface level appearance of political contests taking place and democratic elections and again an open media and things like that, it is essentially just a superficial shell which conceals the fact that in reality all power is basically concentrated at the top, and that you basically have more or less a permanent sort of ruling class of corporate elites and extremely wealthy people that basically essentially control the government. And I think, when all is said and done, that is, I would argue, the most important point that Wolin makes here. And I think this is why it's a compelling concept. And one in which, more and more people seem to be, willing to accept now. Now, you could argue, does that make it then the lesser of two evils than Nazism in Germany? I mean, it depends on the way that you look at it. I mean, you could argue that. But you could also argue that what exists in the United States is actually a more effective system, right? It's actually it's in a sense more evil, and that it's a better way of controlling people. So you can make that argument. I don't want to get necessarily into those moral types of judgments, though. Maybe they're equally bad. I mean, like I said, a lot depends upon the way you look at it. But I think it is important to really delve into this idea and really consider. And again, I'm sort of introducing this concept now. But throughout the remainder of the class, we'll kind of keep coming back to this concept. Is the United States really a democratic government? Do the people actually rule in this country? At the very least, is there a chance of sort of, contesting or opposing the dominant economic interests in this country? Or is basically everything sort of, controlled at the top? And like I said, we'll kind of revisit this topic from various different angles. But I think, right from the very outset of this class, I think you can make a pretty good argument that what Wolin is talking about is actually true. Now, a key question that emerges from this is, what actually is the relationship between capitalism, our economic system, and our political system of democracy? Many academics, and of course, the politicians in our country will tell you that these things go together in a very kind of sort of harmonious way, that they complement each other. Whereas many people, Wolin included, argue that these things are actually in tension with each other, that they actually sort of exist in a kind of contradictory form to one another. That capitalism is an economic system that actually undermines democratic government. And why is that? Because the way in which a capitalist system works is that it tends, well, basically, as we all know, I think it tends to make the rich richer, and the poor, if not poorer, certainly increases the gap between rich and poor, right? And as the capitalism develops, the system of producing things for profit and exchange on the market, tends to, leads to a very strong tendency for capital, the ownership of capital, the ownership of wealth, to concentrate in fewer and fewer hands. And of course, as wealth becomes more and more concentrated in the country, it tends to undermine democratic government, which depends, of course, upon sort of an equal standard being shared by the citizens of the country as a whole. The idea that in theory, each citizen isn't equal to each other and has an equal amount of power in the system. I mean, even just saying that, I mean, it sounds absurd, but I mean, many people would still insist that this is what we have, that we do in fact have a democratic system of government, that somehow the immense concentration of wealth and the enormous power that accrues to people as a result of that concentration of wealth does not give them somehow an unfair advantage in the political process. But I think most people realize, of course, the sort of common sense view that of course it does. And if that is true, then that means that, like I said, these things do not exist. They do not complement each other, but they exist in a kind of a tense relationship with each other. So capitalism basically undermines democracy, basically. Particularly what Wolin likes to refer to as a participatory democracy. A democracy where, again, people don't just vote every 4 years or every 2 years or whatever, but actually play a active role in government and organize and are involved in their local communities and things like that. And that the idea of being a citizen of a democratic government, takes up a very sort of active or becomes a very sort of active part of a person's life. In that regard, I would think most people would have a hard time arguing that idea of kind of active, and more or less full time, commitment of people to participate in political affairs. I would think most people would realize that we very much kind of fall short of that standard for the most part. And of course, if there's any doubt about these things at all, I mean, simply look at recent economic trends within the United States. I mean, we're at, in a 40-year trend of significantly worsening economic inequality in the United States. By many measures, I mean, the United States has never been more economically unequal than it is now. Simply put, I mean, the gap between rich and poor in this country has never been greater than what it is now. Even even the gap between the so-called middle class and the rich, the very rich, has never been greater than it is now by many standards. And again, you have to really consider what are the long-term effects of this. How does this not undermine democratic government? I almost feel that the burden of proof should be on people that want to defend this level of inequality, because it seems so obvious that it would undermine democratic government. So what are sort of the origins of this concentration of power that Wolin talks about? Again, if you go a little bit more, outside of just this article and read his book, or like I said, listen to the interview he does with Chris Hedges, a lot of this has to do with the Cold War, of course. This sort of, oftentimes very, exaggerated drive to fight against communism here in the United States, sort of took away a lot of the restraints on economic power, took away a lot of the regulations and restrictions upon corporate power, sort of allowed corporations to more or less do what they wanted to do in order to fight against communism here in the United States. As I've already pointed out, I mean, in the 1930s, you did see the emergence of a kind of in many ways, radical, even revolutionary, workers' movement in the United States. But by the 1950s, that had basically been entirely crushed. And I would argue that the so-called political left in this country, the sort of more working class resistance to capitalism in this country, has never really recovered from that. But even during the 1930s, I mean, as much as it was a heyday for working class movements in this country, you had strong fascist agitators in this country as well. People like Father Coughlin, who was a Catholic priest who later developed a huge audience on radio. At his peaks, had something like 30 million people listening to his radio program. Very started out as kind of a supporter of Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal in the 1930s, but by within a few years have become very anti-Semitic, very anti-Roosevelt. This is basically seen as kind of like a fascist agitator, essentially, in this country. But even going further back than that, going back beyond the Cold War, before the 1930s, and as we'll talk about more at length when we get to this part of the class, but you could argue that the framers of the Constitution always intended it to be this way. That the Constitution was set up basically to make sure that the wealthy elites pretty much always had, the lion's share of the political power in this country. That the government itself is, set up in a deliberate way to make sure that, working class people don't get too much power, or otherwise they could use that political power to redistribute wealth, to appropriate wealth away from the property owners, and that was something that they did not want to happen. And if so, I mean, that has pretty much played out, from the very origins to this very day. A lot of people lament what they consider to be the dysfunctional nature of the American government today. However, again, that kind of depends upon your perspective as well. If the intention of the government is to make sure that the wealthy elites stay on top, then the United States government is not dysfunctional at all. It's actually functioning, the way it's supposed to function. So I think it's a very important thing for people to keep in mind as well. Again, we'll return to that more when we talk about it. But again, here's sort of an illustration of the Cold War tensions at the time. This is Checkpoint Charlie in Berlin, one of the hot points of the Cold War. Here you see a literal Nazi rally in Madison Square Garden in the 1930s. Many people were talking about Trump's recent Madison Square Garden rally as kind of like a Nazi rally, as you could see. Or this was apparently not the first time that you had a Nazi rally in Madison Square Garden. It may be somewhat hard to see, but you can see this sort of banner here of George Washington and actual Nazi swastikas on either side of it. So again, I mean, it did speak to the emergence of these kinds of pro-Nazi fascist movements that you saw here in the United States during this period of time, and they did have somewhat of a following as well. So I've selected this quote here from Wolin because I think here he does a pretty good job of sort of briefly running through all the different institutions of the political system and showing how all of them essentially have become subordinated to the dictates to the interest of the economic elites. So he writes here, thus the elements are in place: a weak legislative body, meaning Congress, of course. I meant to highlight that in bold as well. So the Congress, when a Republican is in president, basically just when a Republican like George Bush or Trump is president, basically just carries out whatever the president wants them to do for the most part. When you have a Democratic president, however, if I push back a little bit here against what Wallen says as well, when you have a Democratic president like Obama or Biden, all of a sudden Congress has this seemingly unlimited ability to obstruct anything that the president wants to get done. Assuming of course it is in the interest of working class people. He says a legal system that is both compliant and repressive. Here he's talking about another important aspect. The legal system, the courts, the law itself. On the one hand, it's very compliant towards wealthy elites. We see all sorts of examples of, wealthy people getting away with crimes, sometimes literally including murder, getting away with murder. But also the sense that the courts, are able to really, restrict the sort of abuse of political power, especially on the part of the executive branch, on the part of the presidency. Seems to be very limited. Yet the legal system is also a very tough, repressive legal system for poor and working class people. So you have this contrast of a legal system that allows powerful people to seemingly get away with anything, but is extremely tough and extremely punishing towards poor and working class people. This is a double standard there, in other words. A party system, our so-called two-party duopoly, right? Not a monopoly. You have two parties, but basically two parties that are more or less, serving the same interest. Although maybe going about it in somewhat different ways as well. I'm not suggesting that they are completely identical in all ways, just that there is not that significant enough of a difference to really feel that one party, particularly the Democratic Party, is in any meaningful way really challenging the sort of organized business interests, which somewhat more sort of overtly express themselves through the Republican Party. But anyway, as he writes here, a party system in which one party, whether in opposition or in the majority, is bent upon reconstituting the existing system so as to permanently favor a ruling class of the wealthy, the well-connected, and the corporate, while leaving the poorer citizens with a sense of helplessness and political despair. And at the same time, keeping the middle classes dangling between fear of unemployment and expectations of fantastic rewards once the new economy recovers. So, again, both parties essentially play the same role. One party, particularly, the Republican Party, sort of aggressively pursues the business interests of this country, tax cuts, spending cuts, things like that, wars when it's convenient for them. Gotta keep control of that oil, basically, and other resources that they need. Um, and so they get to do that while the Democratic Party, which in theory is supposed to be more of the party of the working class, really also serves the same economic interest. But it does so in a different way, right? The role, the function that the Democratic Party plays is to essentially absorb people's anger and frustration at the injustice, basically, of the economic system, but render it in a way that's basically harmless. Nothing will ever get done to actually change these injustices or anything like that. The system will keep on going the way it always has been, and people will be sort of deluded by this idea that, well, if you just elect more Democrats into office, that somehow things are going to get better, even though even when that actually happens, nothing does get better. And then, of course, there's a lot of gaslighting people into thinking that their economic situations are better than what they actually are. The attempts to portray Biden as the next FDR and all these great things are happening under him is just absurd and easily broken apart with even a little bit of scrutiny. But people will attempt to fool people into thinking that they're doing, so much better than they actually are. And again, to be fair, the Republican Party does the same thing. I remember even before Trump got into office, people talk about all the great things that are happening under Trump, even before he became president. He's going to tackle inflation and all this other stuff. And of course, you can simply, easily expose these things by, our prices actually going down? Of course not. Are these wars ending throughout the world? No, they're getting worse. So, both sides do that. Both sides basically lie to their, voters basically to get them to support them. He goes on. He says that scheme is abetted by a sycophantic and increasingly concentrated media. So you have basically a handful of corporations, giant corporations that control essentially all the media in this country: movies, television, music, radio, publishing, even books, increasingly are more or less, dictated by, giant corporations for the most part. And of course, that produces a very, kind of mediocre media and culture on the one hand, but one which is, again, well, it's mediocre and also as, a function of that, basically, produces a very sort of narrow range of views that, you really can't get beyond for the most part. By the integration of universities with their corporate benefactors, we see all sorts of examples of this, criminalizing protests, for example, on many college campuses, as a result of the requests of their corporate donors and people like that. By a propaganda machine institutionalized and well-funded think tanks and conservative foundations. I would say all these things basically function as a propaganda machine. Universities, the media, think tanks and foundations like the Heritage Foundation, for example, which came up with this Project 2025 thing, which some of you might be familiar with. What a lot of these groups do, yeah, these are basically, privately funded groups that, produce papers and reports that kind of give a kind of pseudo intellectual, pseudo scientific justification to, basically, the brutal kind of class warfare um, policies of both the Republican and the Democratic Party. This idea of re transferring wealth from the poor and the working class to the wealthy elites. Things which are horrible and unconscionable for the most part are sort of given this kind of scientific gloss by organizations like this. And then finally, he closes on by the increasingly closer cooperation between local police and national law enforcement agencies aimed at identifying terrorists, suspicious aliens, and domestic uh, dissidents as well. Of course, we see this playing on now with ICE and things like that. But of course, I mean, he's writing this article in 2003, by the way. So obviously, this has been playing out for a very long time. Add to that the extensive surveillance of the population. And again, you have a system which is increasingly becoming coercive, where people are no longer sort of persuaded, if you will, to sort of or get some sort of benefit from supporting the capitalist system because it does lead to some sort of modest improvement in their living standards. Now it's increasingly more or less being forced upon people. And it seems that as the underlying fundamentals of the economy get worse and worse for most people, the system itself becomes increasingly coercive. Almost like the more people are willing to rebel against the system, the more in which, of course, that system is forced upon them. And we see many examples of that as well. I would argue, in the 20 or so years since this has been written, that things have gotten much worse, over the last 22 years or so. And I think that's important to keep in mind. I feel like there's something else I want to say about. Oh, well, the one thing that he's leaving out here, I mean, you kind of hinted at it when you're talking about the two-party duopoly and how the Democratic Party basically plays the same interests, serves the same interest. But one thing he kind of neglects to point out is the role that unions play in this country as well. Unions which are closely associated with the Democratic Party and essentially subordinate to the Democratic Party also play this role in sort of controlling workers, keeping workers under control, managing and controlling their discontent and their anger and frustration against the economic system. And again, much like the Democratic Party, sort of rendering it in a very sort of harmless way, sort of just sort of defusing that anger so it becomes just sort of like helpless rage basically that doesn't really change anything. Very important thing to point out. And there are many examples that you can point of this. Unions sort of forcing these substandard contracts on their workers, telling them it's a great contract when everyone knows that it's not. I mean, you could get into it more so. Maybe I will in a future class, not so much here. But I mean, if you study, because there have been several high-profile, strikes that have occurred in the last several years. The pattern these unions play in all instances seems to be the same, which is where they tend to isolate workers on strike rather than, building larger movements of workers. The one power that workers have in this country is their strength in numbers, right? They do, in fact, of course, make up the majority of people. So their one major power comes from their strength in numbers, yet unions, in case after case, example after example, and again, if I really had time, I would go into it more here now. But you see numerous examples of unions basically isolating workers when they go on strike. Why do that? Why not bring in other workers who are on strike or other workers who are contemplating going on strike? But the more workers you can sort of bring into these struggles, the more power that you're going to have. Yet union leaders seemingly insist upon isolating workers when they're on strike, and of course these strikes end up being failures. And I think it's important to point that out too, because if there's one organization that you would think would represent an alternative or an opposition to corporate power in this country, it's unions. And when you realize that how complicit unions are in this country as well, again, mostly being subordinated to the Democratic Party for the most part, then you really do get a sense of this idea of total control, right? That there are no institutions within this country that are independent. There are no institutions in this country that are sort of free of corporate control, corporate dominance. That every institution basically serves the same interest. That they all basically exist to basically preserve and prop up the system that we have now. And once you realize that there are no alternatives, there are no, you know, areas that are sort of outside of that control, then that is, by definition, basically total control. Other, more mainstream researchers have pointed this out. Here's an excerpt of an essay here from Page and Gillens, published a little over a decade ago, testing theories of American politics. They basically conclude the same thing here, that basically, well, as I say in the second paragraph, the United States, our findings indicate the majority does not rule, at least not in the casual sense of actually determining policy outcomes. When a majority of citizens disagree with economic elites or with organized interests, they generally lose. So here they've studied, multiple areas of, differences over policy, differences over laws, which groups are favoring a law, which groups are favoring a policy. And they show that time after time, in many instances, of course, the majority, as they say, may agree with what the economic elites want. But in those circumstances where there's a clear clash of interest between the majority of people and the economic elites pretty much always win. So again, what kind of democratic government is that? I've already talked about the two-party duopoly a little bit, so I'll skip over that again here now. A lot of these things, of course, we'll come back to. Wolin does look to the progressive era of the 1890s, and basically, in some ways lasting up until the 1930s and even after, as sort of the heyday of, resistance to corporate control and corporate dominance in this country. But like I said, even if that was true, by the early days of the Cold War, that kind of resistance was pretty much crushed. During the so-called Red Scares of the 1940s and 1950s. The first Red Scare actually happened even earlier than that, after the Russian Revolution, when World War I was still going on. And you've had periodic outbursts of that since then. Wolin spends a lot of time talking about, the failures of U.S. media in this country. I don't have time to go through all of them, but of course, some of the major ones that he focuses on, how the media tended to downplay the basically the theft of the election in 2000. George W. Bush basically did not win the election of 2000, but was, essentially awarded it by the Supreme Court, the same Supreme Court now, which is, many of whom are, literally, the same people are now, or at least some people are now, basically, removing any kind of constitutional limitations on Donald Trump as president. Of course, if anything, an even bigger failure of the media was their coverage of the non-existent weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. I mean, again, all of major media outlets, including the so-called liberal media, basically endorsed this idea that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, gave legitimacy and credibility to the lies basically being spun by the Bush administration, and certainly played a very big role in paving the way for this invasion and the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people that basically died since then. I would also add that the more recently what's going on with Iran, this idea that Trump has to attack Iran before he can get a nuclear weapon, very has very disturbing echoes and similarities with the kind of media narratives that they saw in 2000. So if you think, oh, this is ancient history, this is 2003, it still goes on now. And literally, the media has not learned anything from this. They are still very much, support American empire abroad. There's virtually no, serious, questioning of that. Basically none at all within the mainstream media. You essentially have to go outside of the mainstream media, more of the independent online media that exists, to find any kind of, criticism of American empire. And you could go through all these things. I'm not going to go through all of them now, but the years spent propping up this idea of Russian interference in the election, which has never been proven The attacks on people like Julian Assange, comparisons between Trump and Bernie Sanders, which are ridiculous and absurd. Um, if you go back to the beginning of the pandemic in 2020, the media was making Andrew Cuomo into a hero, and specifically, contrasting him against Trump, which seems, I would say, quite embarrassing in retrospect. Particularly the New York Review of Books. I remember reading articles there where they were really trying to build Andrew Cuomo up into this heroic figure. I also point out, because Wallen himself, mentions that he used to write articles for the New York Review of Books, but basically parted ways with them because of his perception. They were becoming much more of a kind of conservative, establishment type of publications. Again, support for U.S. imperialism, including its allies like Israel, which is extremely distasteful. Whether it's falsely smearing people as being anti Semitic, or just constantly repeating the propaganda points of the Israeli government. I mean the media in this country has that, or even circulating debunked stories like babies being beheaded and things like that, and videos of mass rapes and things like that, when there's no such evidence of things like that existing. There's no video of that existing. Not just here in the United States, but media and governments throughout the world have all been a part of this, and it has had an impact. I mean, the level of trust that Americans have in the media in this country is extremely low, according to a study by the Reuters Institute of Journalism. Only 26% of Americans trust the media, the lowest of any country sampled. Here you have people like, I've included a couple of links to articles written by what's her name, Megan McArdle, one of the worst examples of journalism in the United States today. Just an example of somebody who gets almost every story wrong, but continues to get promoted and move up in the world. Had horrible takes on the Iraq War. Has seen her career advance since then. Covers up for the health insurance lobby and all sorts of corporate interest in the country as well. I'll skip over this. Yeah, I compiled a list of articles where you can see the media, how they kind of spin stories to kind of undermine critical coverage. This is a series of articles which defend Biden's shipment of cluster bombs to the Ukraine. Weapons are basically illegal. But I think in the interest of time, I'll sort of skip through this. If you peruse through the article headlines, you can see that they basically use almost identical language to talk about it, which severely diminishes and undermines the seriousness of what the Biden administration is doing. Essentially they're committing a war crime, but you wouldn't get any sense of that from reading the mainstream media coverage. Wallen also highlights again the failures of education in this country. And you look at that from a bunch of different angles as well. First of all, I mean, let's be clear. I mean, most academics in the United States are very, bourgeois type of people. They're very, have that kind of middle class sensibility, middle class, way of living. I mean, they're not people who are really going to rock the boat in a significant way. They're, for the most part, people who are looking after their own careers, and by doing so, that means basically that you don't upset the wealthy donors that donate to universities and fund research, and the kind of foundations and government grants which fund research as well. I know people like to especially like Fox News likes to create this image that every college is just filled with these radicals in the classroom indoctrinating their youth. Reality, of course, falls far short of that. Again, most college professors, for the most part, like I said, are very sort of middle class people with all that basically entails to it. But beyond that, you see an erosion of liberal arts education. Education even at the college levels become much more sort of highly specialized and technical. Have the sort of more broad-based, learning of politics and philosophy and literature and things like that. Things which I think very much sort of, stimulate people's, critical thinking. I mean, there are certain things you could say about it. It's kind of what some people call cultural capital, things like that. I mean, those things are true as well. But I do think that in the best versions of these things at least do definitely sort of stimulate people to think about things in a more critical way, especially just knowing things about history. Quite obviously, helps you sort of see through a lot of the political uh, narratives that are put forward for the simple fact that oftentimes people kind of recycle, these excuses that they give, whether it's for starting a war or again, sort of justifying this kind of class, warfare that we see going on here uh, uh, domestically. Like, for example, the argument against or for tax cuts, this idea that's going to stimulate all this economic growth and things like that. Even a fairly casual view of history will tell you that these kinds of tax cuts that Trump has done are not going to stimulate the economy to grow in any significant way. Again, education is much more focused on quantitative, it's all math and science and things like that, which is important, obviously. But again, it doesn't teach people these kind of critical thinking skills. It doesn't teach them, knowledge of again, history and things like that. And of course, you've seen in many cases now, especially over the last couple of years, blatant suppression and even criminalization, of people's freedom of speech, of protest on college campuses. You see the precariousness of educators, most educators at the college level or otherwise, don't get paid very well, don't have very good job security in their jobs. I mean, obviously that's going to impact the quality of education that people, you know, get. I mean, do you want people teaching classes that are, having all sorts of personal crises and are just barely able to get by? How is that not going to, affect their job performance to some extent? And of course, finally, one of the bigger issues, of course, is the phenomenon of student loan debt in this country, which has ballooned to over $1 trillion, which vastly, enriches people on Wall Street, basically, but basically saddles, millions of college students with massive debts that they will probably never be able to pay off. Now, Wallen himself talks about, protesting apartheid in South Africa. He was a professor at Princeton in the 1980s, and talks about how virtually none of the Princeton faculty, despite portraying themselves as being sort of very liberal-minded people, supported the anti-apartheid protests, which again doesn't say much for their credentials as these liberal-minded people who supposedly care about social justice and things like that. And of course, you see a very similar things playing out nowadays, where you have people protesting the Israeli uh, genocide of Palestinians living in Gaza. Very much the similar thing. Nowadays people, think of, oh, of course, protesting apartheid in South Africa. Of course, that was a justifiable goal. But back then in the 1980s, it was considered, a politically controversial issue. Much like this is now. There's no doubt in my mind that people doing this now will be fully vindicated, in the passage of history. And I think it's quite, shameful and disgusting, really, that people, are attempting to, smear these people as being anti-Semitic, when I've literally seen no evidence of that. I've not seen a single instance of people holding up an anti-Semitic sign. I've not heard any audio or have personally encountered anyone saying anything anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish, in other words. I've not read of any, instances of violence, committed against Jewish students or otherwise. I mean, when you have large groups of people, you can't, control the actions of everybody. So I wouldn't be surprised if there are isolated examples of things like this happening. But I've certainly not seen any evidence of any kind of large scale support or any, significant, instances of any of these things occurring. Literally not even one. And what these people are, clearly appalled by and trying to protest the mass murder of thousands of people. I mean, whether or not you want to call it a genocide or not, some people get hung up over that, the use of that word. I don't see why. I think it's quite clear. Uh, but that aside, whether you want to use that term or not, I mean, these are people that are against, again, thousands of people being murdered by the Israeli government, including women and especially children as well. How is that anti-Semitic, or why do you attribute evil motives basically to people that are just simply appalled by what they are seeing? Something which has no um it's there's no contrast here. There's no comparable atrocity being inflicted against the people of Israel either. You know, um, and most people that I've spoken to about this clearly see a separation between Zionism as a political ideology and Judaism as a religion, and they are not anti-Jewish; they are anti-Zionist, including many Jewish people are anti-Zionist as well. So something else I'm sure we'll talk more about. But and I think the U.S. support of Israel plays a very big role here in that the U.S. has basically become what some people like to refer to as a superpower, or basically an empire. It is a global empire, is a global capitalist empire. And of course, part of that means that the U.S. has to, control other countries in the world, especially countries that have resources that the United States wants, or at the very least wants to keep out of the hands of other people, of other governments, including and probably most especially oil. And of course, Israel is strategically located in the major oil producing region of the world. So why does the U.S. support Israel? Some people point to the Israeli lobby that exists here in the United States, which is certainly very powerful and has very deep ties with many American politicians, including former President Biden, by the way. But I think it's not solely just a result of the influence of lobbyists, essentially throwing money at politicians. I think it's because Israel, again, plays a strategic role here, and that it essentially functions as kind of like an attack dog for the United States. The United States is able to, essentially sick Israel on other countries it doesn't like or sees as a threat, whether it's Iran or Syria or Iraq or Lebanon. I mean, what of course, connects all these things together, of course, is that these are all countries that, again, exist in the largest oil producing region in the world. And the U.S. wants to make sure that it has continued control and dominance of this oil producing region. Even though the U.S. itself, produces a lot of oil also. It wants to have more or less global control over the supply of oil. There's also another thing, which I don't want to get too complicated here, but, the sale of oil also basically supports the U.S. Dollar as well. To buy oil, for the most part, you have to have U.S. currency in order to be able to do it. It will only be sold to you if you have U.S. Currency, which means, of course, the U.S. then has additional leverage over all these other countries. And then basically, if they want to be able to gain access to U.S. currency, the dollar, they have to, be in good standing with the United States. Otherwise, the U.S. can cut them off, as it attempted to do with Russia, for example. So it's quite clear that those are, the interests that are basically being, served here. And it's kind of a shame that in an American politics class, we don't often focus more on the international or even, global dimensions of U.S. power. Usually in American politics class like this, you usually just focus on the, political institutions themselves. And we will for the most part. But at the very least, at the outset of the class, I think it's very important to at least give sort of like an overview of all these things, particularly as the U.S. has become this, again, this massive empire, since the end of World War II. And also arguably an empire that is on the downslide also. And that is also animating a lot of the policies that you see coming out of the United States. The United States is sort of, in many ways becoming increasingly desperate to preserve its sort of fading power in the world. And that means more wars and conflicts with other governments, particularly, China, which the U.S. sees as a threat to its own power. And Iran, by the way, is sort of even Iran is sort of a function of that, as well as the Iranian and Chinese governments have better relations, as does Russia and China, for that matter, as well. Okay. So, what are sort of the effects of this kind of political concentration of power? Well, it has, it produces very much a kind of vicious cycle, which means that, it sort of reinforces itself and all these problems get worse and worse and worse. The public, of course, does, for the most part, correctly see that they do not have any real power. So, what do? They drop out of politics. They don't vote. Voter turnout in this country is very low. But of course, as that happens, it only makes these, it further consolidates the power of the ruling elites. And so everything gets worse and worse. You have government surveillance over people, companies surveilling people, even these sort of aspects of things that you associate with fascist governments, propaganda, surveillance, things like that. I mean, even those things are becoming much more a reality here. And again, as I've already, hinted at a couple of times, I mean, you see this attempt by the Supreme Court and by the Trump administration to basically, strip away whatever restraints there still are on the exercise of political power by the president as well. So the president is in many ways sort of morphing more and more into an overt dictatorship as well. Here you see a couple excerpts from, the New York Times about, companies keeping their workers under surveillance as well. I want to kind of move on a little bit, though, because I know I've been talking at length already. You have the mass incarceration state in this country. Again, a very punishing legal system, which punishes the poor, puts them in prison, while, again, wealthy people get to, like I said, in some cases, literally get away with murder. We have more people basically incarcerated than almost any other country. Our per capita incarceration rate, the rate of people incarcerated, relative to the population of the country, is basically the highest in the world, even greater than countries like China, which of course we're always being told is, a horrible, evil dictatorship and things like that. Here's some websites here about mass incarceration. Now, since a lot of this does revolve around, again, corporate power and capitalism and preserving the power and the wealth, basically, of the ruling elites, I think we should, examine some trends that speak to that. So we've already seen, again, the massive explosion of inequality in this country. Here you see the top 1%, but also the top 0.01%, the basically the 1/10 of the 1%, have seen their wealth grow massively since the 1970s, whereas basically the bottom 20% has, declined in many instances. And basically everybody else, people in the middle have basically, seen their living standards basically, stagnate, not significantly improve, while, again, the very, very wealthy have seen their fortunes go up immensely. And again, obviously there's people who are already rich to begin with who have become just like insanely, obscenely rich. I mean, in ways that you can't even really properly comprehend, I don't think. And again, while this has happened, wages in the country have basically stagnated. So while some people are, accumulating hundreds of billions of dollars, the average working class person is basically not seeing their income go up significantly, especially adjusted for inflation, basically not seeing their living standards go up at all, basically. You have to pay people a little bit more because of the rise in inflation, prices going up. But when you factor in those price increases, are people actually being able to buy more stuff? No, they're just buying, their buying power is essentially the same, or in many cases, even less than what it was in, say, like the 1980s, basically. While this is happening, debt levels have massively increased in this country. This is actually corporate debt, which has just ballooned massively, especially since 2008. You can see even higher than it was in 2008. And of course, the massive debt bubble that built up prior to the Great Recession of 2008 was a big part of the reason why it became as bad as it did. You see debt levels among corporations are even higher than they were now. And of course, government debt is getting significantly high as well. Now up to about $36 trillion. I mean, the highest basically that it's ever been. even adjusted for inflation, the highest it's been basically since World War II, which is, the greatest war in history, the most massive war in history. Here you see also the sort of hollowing out, what people often refer to as the hollowing out of manufacturing in the United States. Of course, the secret to American middle class living in the era, the period of time after World War II, was that, factory workers enjoyed a pretty good standard of living. But most of those factory jobs, as we know, have no longer exist. They've either completely gone away or they've been outsourced to other countries. And besides that, the role that manufacturing plays in the economy as a whole, what people often refer to as the GDP, the gross domestic product of the economy, sort of like a measurement of all the economic activity that goes on within the country, has fallen significantly, right? As you can see here, in 1947, made up about 25% of the economy. In more modern day, this is from 2017, but fairly recent, only about 11%. So a significant decline of its share of the economy as a whole. Whereas what is known as the FIRE sector of the economy, finance, insurance, and real estate, has grown from about 10% of the economy to about 20%. So this leads to people saying that we have now become a financialized economy rather than an industrial economy. What does that mean? Is that something that should be celebrated? Well, some people do. Some people try to, spin it. Well, who wants to work in a factory anyway, right? Wouldn't you rather work in an office on Wall Street or something like that? Many people might say yes. But of course, the reality is not as simple as that. First of all, not everyone can do that, of course. But how does the FIRE sector make its money? Well, what do financial institutions, how do they make their money? Through debt, basically. Many people refer to them as debt merchants. They basically sell debt. That's their product that they're selling, debt. Here's some credit. So we'll give you some money, but then you got to pay it back to us at a massive interest rate. So that's how they make their money, through interest payments, insurance, through jacking up your premiums, and then also denying you coverage whenever you need your health insurance to come through for you. Real estate, again, by jacking up mortgage rates and things like that. So are people comfortable with it? This is basically how the American economy is run nowadays. This basically makes up the largest share of the economy as a whole. Healthcare also, of course, is a major part of that. Technology, these big corporate monopolies like Apple and Google and things like that are a big part of it as well. But again, a significant part of the American economy comes from, again, interest payments, people paying higher insurance premiums, higher mortgages. A mortgage is basically another form of debt anyway. Is that how you want and this is where, the profits come from. So how do you get more profits out of the economy? By raising those things, by forcing people to pay higher interest rates, higher insurance premiums, and things like that. Are people comfortable with that? If we had to actually put this to a vote, would people vote for an economy like this? It's a fair question, right? But for better or for worse, I would say for the worse, this is basically how our economy is structured. And again, this will be another topic that we return to more. You again see credit card loan defaults significantly jumping up. So not only are people's credit card debts going higher and higher and higher, but the amount of people who are defaulting on their credit cards, not being able to pay, make their payments on time, has gone up significantly over the last year. Not a good sign, not a sign of a healthy economy, certainly. And I plan on showing a few more economic talking points in a moment, but if all this economic stuff is a little too abstract, I do think this is having a real impact on people's lives. This is literally shortening people's lives. The economic burdens that are placed upon people, again, the stagnant wages, the rising cost of living, the inability of people's incomes to sort of keep up with the rising cost of living for housing, healthcare, things like that, is literally taking a toll on the lives of people in this country. Life expectancy in the United States is very low. compared to most other countries of a similar economic level. You can see here it's showing that life expectancy really kind of took like a nosedive when COVID hit. But even prior to that, you can see it was trending downwards. I think the real story here is that when you compare again the United States to other countries, there's a significant gap in life expectancy here in the United States, the wealthiest country in the world, and we're constantly, of course, being told it's the greatest country in the world. Well, shouldn't people in the greatest country in the world be living the best quality lives? Shouldn't we have the best quality of life in this country? What makes it the greatest country then? But as you can see, I mean, that's just not the case. I mean, people are actually die, much earlier here in the United States than they do in many other countries, which I would assume you would agree is not a good thing, right? I mean, I could almost picture somebody saying, "Oh yeah, well, Americans just live, live fast, die young, that kind of wild and crazy life." That's obviously not what's happening though. I mean, these people are, dying of treatable, illnesses, and are many times, being inflicted with illnesses that come from their lifestyle and come from their quality of life and things like that. I mean, that is actually, of course, what is actually going on. Of course, you see the phenomenon of drug overdose deaths in the United States, of course, continue to get worse and worse also. So, I mean, these are all consequences of this concentration of power at the top. And of course, many people are upset with it. One point I neglected to mention is that, especially when you look at the Democratic Party, I mean, the Democratic Party leadership loves to blame their own voters for when they lose an election, as they did in 2024. But what is the problem? Is it the voters or is it the leadership of the party? The leadership of the party is completely out of touch with their voters on almost every issue that you can imagine. Democratic voters are, generally speaking, pretty liberal people. They want single-payer health care. They want free college education. They want wealthy people to pay higher taxes. They want the kind of things that you would, usually actually in many cases kind of associate with what we call socialism for the most part. Those are Democratic voters. They're also, for the most part, pretty anti-war. They're against what Israel's doing, for example. The leadership doesn't support any of those things. The party leaders are completely out of touch with what their voters want, yet they blame not themselves, but the voters. Why people don't come out and show up for them in stronger numbers for elections. It never occurs to them that they're the problem. Maybe we need a party leadership that actually represents what the voters in this country wants. And again, these are strong majorities of people. You can find nationwide polls that show pretty strong majority support for single-payer health care in this country. Again, meaning taking into account both Republican and Democratic and independent voters as well. You can still show pretty good majority support for those things, even with more conservative voters, generally pulling those numbers down. But if you look at only Democratic voters as sort of a subset of the population as a whole, even stronger majority. You see overwhelming support for these things. But the politicians don't support these things. So I would say that they're the problem here. They don't support the policies that their voters want them to support. Yet they, again, like I said, blame the voters, not themselves. All right. So there are a few more things I want to cover here, and I'm going to start to wrap things up. I probably won't even get a chance to talk about my article here. Maybe I'll bring it up in a future class. Though I do think it's important, in many ways, complement some of what Roland is talking about here. But I want to focus on, some more, topical stuff. So the next several slides, I'm going to show some more, data that I've assembled from some recently published articles. And give more kind of, current events kind of feel to what is going on here. So I've even included, the source of these articles, mainly to some extent, keep it straight in my own head, because for the most part, this is kind of the first time I'm, presenting some of this stuff. So I hope it kind of flows together seamlessly. I will certainly try my best. And I hope it's not too technical or anything like that. But I think there are some important things that we should delve into a little bit more here. So with that being said, I mean, basically, and again, like I said, these articles were very recently published. One sort of, reflects on what is going on in the country, in the context of July 4th, which, by the way, makes up 249 years since the Declaration of Independence. So next year would be the 250th year anniversary. Kind of an important milestone, right? Now, and of course, we'll talk about the Declaration of Independence more. But of course, one of the famous phrases that emerges from that is that people have the right to alter or abolish oppressive governments. Something to keep in mind. Now, what has happened recently in this country? You have this budget signed into law by Trump, which is basically what people would call, what at least Marxists would call class warfare. A war of the rich against the poor, to put it in sort of stereotypical terms. I mean, probably you could say more accurately, a war of the rich against everybody else, the poor, the working class, the middle class, however you want to define it. A war of the rich against basically everybody else, like I said, to shift more and more of the economic burdens of funding the government onto these people, cutting back more of this, services that they receive from the government, in exchange, and get bigger tax cuts for themselves. That's essentially what they refer to as class warfare. And this is one of the worst instances of class warfare that we've ever seen in the history of this country. It slashes Medicaid, it slashes food assistance to basically fund tax cuts for the rich. This is from the Socialist Equality Party, a small Marxist political party here, which I think provides a lot of good analysis basically of what is going on in this country. Trump has threatened to jail or possibly deport the New York mayoral candidate Zoran Mamdani. Obviously goes against the institutions of a democratic government. Trump has also opened a concentration camp in Florida, what they call Alligator Alcatraz, which has recently been subject to coverage, which reveals the horrible conditions of people in this prison. They don't want to call it a prison, but that's basically what it is. Trump has also hinted at being that he will detain U.S. Citizens, and some reports say that U.S. citizens are already being held there. 5 months into Trump's second term, again, you've seen numerous executive orders asserting almost essentially unlimited power on the part of Trump. Trump has already defied the court rulings, lower court rulings in many ways. The federal judicial branch is more than just the Supreme Court. There are courts that exist underneath it as well. And they are, whether it's, opposing Trump's, attempts at deportation and things like that. Courts have, in many instances, ruled against the Trump administration's ability to do things. And in some instances, the Trump administration just blatantly defied the courts. But more importantly, has received the support of the Supreme Court, which has a very conservative majority on it for the most part, and has basically given the sort of the green light to sort of stripping away a lot of the checks and balances, a lot of the limitations on the presidential power of Trump, including doing things like this. We have seen mass ICE raids and military deployment in cities like Los Angeles, for example, the criminalization of dissent, including the arrest of Gaza genocide protesters. And this is, just barely, 6 months into Trump's first year as president. You have the dismantling of public health in this country, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, overruled by Trump appointee, ignoring scientists on vaccines. This is in part, contributed to a massive measles outbreak in the United States, sort of the worst in decades, basically, or basically the worst since measles was essentially declared eliminated in 2000, but now because of the low vaccination rates is threatening to come back again. This is from another article by an economist named Michael Roberts. He highlights some of the important aspects of Trump's budget. 163 billion in federal spending cuts proposed by Trump. Non-defense spending slashed by 22%, the lowest since 2007. Massive increase for the military, even more massive increase for homeland security. Um, the impact on programs like Medicaid are severe. I mean, over the course of 10 years, this is, trillions of dollars that will be cut out of the budget. 45% of Americans who are lifted out of poverty rely on it. It's projected, as many as maybe, 17 million people might lose their health insurance now as a result of this. Millions could lose their health insurance, affecting not just the poor, but also near poor families. Safety net programs also face reductions as well, most notably food stamps. Now, again, people might think like, well, that is horrible, but thank God, I may not be on Medicaid, so at least I won't be personally affected. But really, people will, because what this is probably going to do is probably going to raise insurance costs for everybody. Because what happens when people lose their insurance? Now you have less people enrolled. Hospitals and healthcare providers are receiving less payments now, so they're going to be forced to try to recoup their costs somewhere else. So charging people higher amounts. Besides the cuts to Medicaid, the Trump budget is also basically making it harder for people to buy health insurance through the Affordable Care Act. So basically, the overall effect is that most people are probably going to see their health insurance premiums go up as a result of this. Again, who benefits from this then? So tax cuts, of course, favor high-income households and corporations. Spending cuts hurt low and middle-income families. According to Yale University, the bottom 20% will basically see their incomes decline by 5%. So even though their taxes are going to go down a little bit, well, they're not paying much in taxes, in the first place, and whatever economic assistance they were getting through things like Medicaid and other things like that, they're actually going to see their overall income go down. Why? Because of course, more and more of their income will be stretched to pay for these other things, and basically they're going to see a reduction in their income because of that. The second lowest 20% will see their income go down by a little over 1%. Only basically the top 20% will see their incomes, increase by this. And of course, these are people who already have, pretty high incomes to begin with. Median household incomes are already down 2.8% due to Trump's tariffs. The impact, U.S. median male wage is lower today than in 1973 in real terms. This also comes from an article by another economist, Brian Greene. All these economists are basically Marxist economists, and I make no apologies for that. I mean, I think Marxist economists basically are the only ones that really help, cut through the bullshit basically, and really give you a sense of what's going on here in this country, and help to clarify things too in a way that's easy to understand. Rising inequality and debt. Again, wealth and income inequality will worsen, which has already gotten significantly bad over a 40-year trend. Public debt projected to rise by 3.3 trillion by 2034. Debt to GDP ratio could hit 125%. Annual deficits rise to 6.9% of GDP. So basically, the government, which is already highly in debt to begin with, already to the tune of about $36 trillion. I mean, try to imagine how much that is. I mean, it's grown from about 5 trillion in 2008 to over 36 trillion today. And as a result of Trump's policies, this will grow to about $40 trillion. I mean, we are heading to an unsustainable level of debt. And it's already showing signs that investors are increasingly getting worried of continuing to loan the United States government money. They're like, how is the U.S. going to be able to pay for all this? I mean, interest payments alone are already over $1 trillion. $1 trillion the U.S. has to make in interest, because governments, like other like households and consumers and businesses, borrow money, and the U.S. government does that as well as other governments do too. But the U.S. government has borrowed so much money that people are becoming worried now that it is not going to be able to pay off these debts, or that the cost of paying even interest on the debt is going to so significantly impact the stability of the U.S. government that people are really, worrying. What is the long-term sustainability of this? And why is the debt grown so large? Well, I mean, a key factor here, of course, is that most of this debt has accumulated since 2008. So what the government has done basically is to essentially, take the burden off of businesses in this country by taking on more and more debt itself, these bailouts and all these, spending programs to sort of revive the economy. Critics of this would say this is only sort of delaying the inevitable. That what they're trying to do is, prevent another sort of 2008 style crash from happening. But it's sort of a pointless effort. I mean, they're only, like I said, delaying the inevitable, basically. And when the inevitable does come, it'll probably be even worse because of all the extra debt that has been piled on, basically. Keep that in mind. So again, U.S. imperialism has, declined significantly over the last several, uh, uh, decades. U.S. again, as I've already said, has become much more of a financial power that rather than an industrial power. What this does, though, is it basically, creates an economy that functions by, sort of sucking up value created by other sectors of the economy, and of course, especially from workers as well. So they get rich by basically loading up other people with debt, and again, insurance costs and things like that, which basically reduce their standard of living, but enriches people on Wall Street, basically. And it also produces a very unstable economy as well, which is prone to, crashes, as we've seen now. We've seen two in our lifetime that are almost of, the same magnitude of the crash that led to the Great Depression in the 1930s. I mean, how many more times can something like this happen and we avoid the full impact of it? Of course, many people did suffer after 2008 and in 2020. You still remember, seeing, these long lines of people in their cars waiting to get food. In 2020, they didn't have money to buy food because the, economy just froze up, basically. Again, the treasury market. So the way in which the United States government raises money is by, selling bonds. And this has grown basically from 5 trillion to 29 trillion today, largely fueled by military spending and corporate bailouts. So just a massive amount of debt has been piled on the government books, basically for the benefit of corporations. But, again, how much longer can they actually keep this coming? Furthermore, most of this sort of financial capital that circulates around, most of it's just for, speculation anyway. Only about 15% of it, according to another economist, Nick Beams, basically goes for investment in, building things, creating jobs, basically. Most of it's just, buying, Bitcoin and things like that, or speculating on stocks. I mean, it's been a proven fact that a lot of these corporations, when they get money from the government or when they borrow money from banks, they just use it rather than build stores and factories and things like that. They just use it to buy their own stock, which basically inflates the value of their stock. It doesn't do anything to create actual jobs, let alone high, good paying jobs. So a lot of it's just, essentially just, wasted on these sort of short-term, financial scams, basically. 85% of it, again, according to this. Financial market risks. Again, Moody's downgraded, one of these rating agencies. It sort of rates how creditworthy you are. Everyone who's familiar with the idea of a credit score kind of knows how this idea works. Well, again, governments basically have their credit scores as well. And recently, the U.S. credit score or credit worthiness was downgraded. The 30-year Treasury yield, the interest rate, hit over 5%. Now, again, I realize some of the stuff is complicated, but basically what that's saying is that when the interest rate, or what they call the yield on that bond, goes up, that means that people are less willing to buy the bond, right? They're saying that we want a higher interest. It's basically saying, okay, we'll loan you money, but we want to charge you a higher interest rate. So investors are now saying they want to essentially charge the U.S. government a higher interest rate to loan money to it because they're worried about it. And so the U.S. What that does also is that means, of course, that as those interest rates go up, the U.S. has to pay more money out. So now, again, interest payments on the U.S. Debt have become so high that they are now basically one of the highest um, items on the U.S. Budget. Again, interest payments could consume 30% of federal uh, revenue by 2035 versus 9% in 2021. Think what a massive increase that is. And again, this can be a bit technical here, but the interest rates on government bonds basically functions as the baseline for interest rates in the rest of the economy as well. It comes back to this very sort of complicated notion, where do interest rates come from? Well, because the U.S. debt has been considered so safe, it has been up until recently been considered almost like a risk-free investment. So you buy U.S. bonds, you're guaranteed to get your money back and then some. It's very low risk. So that the interest rate on U.S. bonds basically functions as sort of like the foundation of interest rates for the rest of the economy as a whole. So essentially, whatever the U.S. bond interest rate is, you simply tack on a couple of extra points to determine interest rates for banks in general, for interest in the economy as a whole. But what happens though? As the interest rate on U.S. bonds go up, that's also going to drive up interest rates in the rest of the economy as well. So now businesses and consumers and households that need to borrow money or receive credit, they're going to see their interest rates go up as well, just because the U.S. interest rate is good, the U.S. bond interest rate is going up because of the financial instability of the United States government. What this translates into, of course, this is all a bit too technical, is that again, people whose incomes are already stretched are going to get even more stretched, right? They're going to have to pay even higher interest payments now because of this, because of stuff like this. And that's also a troubling sign because you have a slowing economy as well. The economy is slowing down. It did well because of the pandemic era, emergency policies that were basically put into place, at least relative to other countries, much slower than China, by the way. But compared to European countries and Japan, the U.S. economy is growing pretty fast for a couple of years. But that is slowing down now. And Trump's policies, his tariffs, of course, the other major thing that he's doing, are slowing down the economy even more so. Why that is a troubling sign is that usually when the economy is slowing down, banks usually lower interest rates, right? Because the lower the interest rate is, the more people borrow money. The lowering interest rates is basically seen as a way of sort of stimulating the economy, whereas raising interest rates basically slows down or depresses the economy. What we have now is a situation where the economy is slowing down and interest rates are going up. That's not good. That's a very bad sign. And it could be one of the primary indicators here that we're heading into a major recession in the future. Because again, if the economy is slowing down and you can't lower interest rates to stimulate the economy more, and instead of interest rates are actually going up, that's going to further slow down the economy. That's not good. That's very bad, actually. Again, the MAGA theory, the tax cuts are going to spur economic growth, is bullshit. Trickle down economics, they call it as. It has literally never worked. They've been doing this since the 1980s. It doesn't work. I mean, they've tried it numerous times. It does not stimulate the economy to grow, not nearly as much as what they anticipate it will. Because in theory, they're saying that this won't, these massive tax cuts for the wealthy will not add to the overall government deficit, because the economy will grow so much that even though companies are being taxed at a lower rate and wealthy households are being taxed at a lower rate, that their wealth will go up so much that even at a lower percentage rate, they'll still be kicking up more overall. That's completely crazy, and has literally never worked. So of course this is going to massively explode. So we're already in a situation where the U.S. is over $36 trillion in debt, and Trump's solution is to add a couple more $1 trillion to the debt. That's literally what they are doing. It's crazy stuff. Again, the Q1 GDP, again, sort of the overall measure of the economy, fell already in the first quarter. Profits are going down. If corporate profits fall, investment levels drops, a recession follows. Again, this is from Michael Roberts, who's an economist I read quite often. Rising tariffs and interest rates squeeze profits even more. Citibank predicts just 1% earnings growth in 2025, basically non-existent. And this is Roberts, who is an economist. His measure of what he calls the rate of profit in the economy in the G7, which are basically the seven largest Western economies in the world. Japan gets thrown in there too, but basically, the United States, Canada, the four largest European economies, United Kingdom, Germany, France, Italy, and then Japan, like I said, make up seven. So when you look at the overall rate of profit, not just the United States, but all these countries are doing badly. And you can kind of sort of track, the growth and falls in the rate of profit. How much profit, the percentage of profit that's being generated relative to investment in the economy. So after World War II, it was pretty high, and then basically it fell in the 1970s. Anyone that is familiar with the history of this period of time, these were not good periods of time. Then it rose a little bit in the 1980s, but again, basically by holding back workers' wages, outsourcing, again, more profits being generated by finance, which some people would argue doesn't create real value. Basically creates value by basically sucking up profits produced in the rest of the economy, but then it registers as profits for the economy as a whole in a very concentrated way. And then it's been basically falling again since then. You'll also notice that each peak in the profit rate is lower than the last peak, 14%, 12%, 11%. And now it's basically falling again. And you see just the rate of profit on capital employed, the overall, the productive sectors of the economy. This term productive sector means basically the non-financial sectors of the economy. You see it also falling. I don't mean to exaggerate here, but I mean, I do think this is an important question that the people have to take in mind. I think that we may actually be living in the end of a historical era, which is the capitalist era. I think we are really seeing increasing signs. I haven't provided all the evidence that would be necessary to show this here, but I certainly could provide more. But a lot of what I've been reading and seeing, really seems to suggest that the capitalist system, not just in the United States, but worldwide, is really breaking down in a way that's very hard to imagine itself reversing itself again. I mean, again, it's not just the U.S. economy; it's economies throughout the world. They are all slowing down. They're all profiting less. The overall economy, yes, there are certain monopolies that are able to basically suck up money because of their protected status. That's why you have these big giant mega corporations that seem like they're doing well. But when you look at the rate of profit in the economy as a whole, not just in these handful of giant mega corporations, the rest of the economy as a whole is not doing well. Businesses are not doing well. Small and medium sized and even fairly large businesses are not doing well outside of these few exceptions, like I said. And I don't see how this is going to change, how this trend is going to reverse itself anytime soon without something horrific happening, like another world war, which is basically what did happen to basically restart the profit rate in the economy after World War II. I mean, in a sense, this really goes beyond party politics, right? This is beyond Republicans and Democrats and things like that. This is what we're really talking about, the end of, like I said, a historical era. I think so, at least. Again, investment is slowing down. I'll move through this a little bit quicker now. I know I realize I've been beating this horse now for a while, but again, a lot of evidence to show you that investment is slowing down. Again, profit rates are slowing down. Retail sales are stagnating. China's doing okay, but China has a very drastically different economic system, right? China has an economic system which does not rely upon the free market as much as ours. It's the free market economies which seem to be doing poorly. And if you look at other countries throughout the world, in Africa, in Asia, South Asia, and Central Asia, in Latin America, I mean, all these regions of the world are doing badly. Their economies are all slowing down. These are economies that many countries had large numbers of poor people to begin with, and it's getting even worse. So, I don't see how that is necessarily going to change anytime soon. Again, just going back to the U.S. itself, housing market collapse, home sales down 4.5%, new home sales tank negative 13% month over month, and negative 6% year over year, basically from the last year. People aren't buying houses. Well, why should that be a surprise? People can't afford houses, right? I mean, if anyone has any experience, shopping for a home now, I mean, maybe we can share experiences here. I mean, it's terrible trying to find a house now. You're looking at houses that cost like half $1 million, and they're kind of like shitty houses. They're no offense to the people that live there, but they're small homes. They need lots of work, but they cost like $500,000. That's how much the housing market is inflated. Again, companies aren't reinvesting their profits. Again, the bottom 60% of households are seeing their cost of living increases, grow, and their incomes are just not growing enough to keep pace with it. Roberts and other people also argue again that this idea that or some people argue that now we have entered an era what they refer to as geonomics, where once again political interests are dominating over economics. Roberts criticizes this idea. No, this is just a continuation of economic interests dominating politics. What we have now though are the economic conditions are so bad basically throughout the world that you see governments now fighting each other. That's what's behind these tariffs and things like that. Trump is doing these tariffs because the U.S. economy is not doing well, and so it's trying to sort of extract wealth out of these other countries by basically making them pay higher prices and things like that, or reduce their flow of exports to the United States, even though the U.S. benefits greatly from the cheap imports that come from these countries, and also basically is able to export higher priced goods to them as well. Again, give it a sort of an overall historical view. You have the so-called golden age after World War II. Things basically started going bad in the 1970s and have kind of never really fully recovered from that either. It's basically just been one sort of short-term way of sort of gaming the system to make it seem like things are going well, but inevitably things crash again, and things are kind of just getting worse and worse. I know I'm kind of going through this pretty quickly now, but I kind of want to wrap things up. Of course, climate change getting worse and worse. Government's basically not doing anything to deal with it at all. The march to World War III, international conflicts are heating up. The risk of a nuclear war has, never been greater now than it has been probably since like the 1980s. The U.S. is not doing well, right? I mean, the war in Ukraine not going well. Iran, they failed basically to, humiliate Iran. I mean, supposedly though, the reason why Israel asked for a ceasefire so quickly is that they were surprised by Iran's ability to strike back at them. And their missile defense system was not able to block out a lot of the missiles, and so kind of quickly, backed off basically. The tariffs are not working, which should not be much of a surprise. The dollar is losing value as well. We talked about how the U.S. dollar is a currency that's used throughout the rest of the world. It's now losing its value. Again, in large part because of the escalating debts here in the United States. And again, a slow-growing economy can't lower interest rates. The bond interest rates are pushing it up. Plus, if you lower interest rates, that usually contributes to inflation as well. So you're also hemmed in by that. People don't want to risk inflation again, which has seen prices massively escalate. I mean, I'm sure nobody wants to see that. Nobody wants to see inflation go up. But, as the dollar loses value, that will generally increase prices as well. The idea of how currencies have value, sort of stems from their value related to other currencies. And again, it's a fairly complicated thing to talk about, but the basic idea of again, is that the U.S. is sort of losing its value. Its buying power is decreasing rather than increasing. Although, of course, people would also say, well, that may be true, but the U.S. is still the dominant currency in the world. No other country is going to replace the dollar. Well, that may be true. But again, as an indicator of the overall health of the American economy, it's certainly not a good thing that the U.S. dollar is losing this value. And again, that's also in many ways, related to the tariffs, the high levels of debt in this country, the fears of inflation in this country as well. Less people, basically, currencies have a kind of supply and demand dynamic to them also, right? Other countries literally buy currencies, so they buy dollars or they hold dollars. And what you're saying is that other countries, particularly Japan and China, are offloading a lot of these things. Like, well, we don't want to hold all these dollars anymore. So as they do so, the demand for the dollar decreases, and that basically lowers the value of the dollar. So I mean, there's a lot of signs here that point to some sort of crisis in the brewing, in the making, basically. Again, the first 6 months of the year, the dollar fell by over 10% against six other major currencies. Not good. Now, again, this would usually be the point where I would start to talk about my own article, but I realize I've gone on this long enough. So I'm just going to want to end things here. Again, it's important, I think, to especially keep awareness of all these economic issues, because this is essentially what we are, talking about here, right? This is a system of government which is, designed to perpetuate the political power of the wealthy elites, to make sure that the capitalist system basically functions. There's no real opposition to capitalism, even as the capitalist system itself starts to decline. Of course, it's declining, but you wouldn't see that from the point of view of the very wealthiest people, right, who are still doing well. So even if the economy is declining overall, these people still have an interest in making sure that their interests are still taken care of, and they're gonna fight like hell, basically, to make sure that they still basically get to control the government, even as the economic situation gets worse for other people. In fact, as it gets worse for other people, they're going to fight even harder to make sure that they hold on to that political power. That's why I think it's so important to point these things out. I think that unfortunately, people don't have a good awareness of how class, social class plays out in this country, and how class conflict plays out in the country as well. So that's why I want to spend so much time talking about those things. But okay, so I'm going to wrap things up here, and we will pick this up next class. All right, so take care, everyone.